The night was alive with static. Broken voices flickered in and out of the ether, thin and frayed, as if the desert itself was chewing them into dust. A strained call cracked through the interference command. "This is Orion 3. The mission is lost. Repeat, lost." Then nothing but silence, heavy and suffocating. A calm reply cut in sterile as a machine Orion 3 acknowledged. "All ground assets are compromised. Air support disengage. Return to base. Abandon the ground team." High above at 20,000 feet, Major Cassandra Ward sat inside the cockpit of her A-10 Thunderbolt II call sign, Valkyrie. The emerald glow of her heads-up display painted her eyes in cold green light. Numbers drifted across the armored glass altitude airspeed fuel, all precise, all detached. Beyond that canopy stretched the Halidon Gorge, a black scar across the desert hidden under the weight of midnight. Far below, men she had never met were out of time. Cassie's gloved hands rested on the stick and throttle with a stillness that looked like calm, but felt like restraint, an old wound holding its breath. The order still echoed in her ears. "Return to base." 3 words, easy to follow, easy to explain away later. But Orion's voice was still there too, clinging to the static. Not a command, a confession. A soldier accepting death while his brothers fought in shadows. Cassie blinked once slow, her jaw set. The desert wind whispered around her canopy, though she couldn't feel it. What she felt was a weight pressing against her chest, heavy, insistent. She had carried it for 20 years, the memory of another voice. Another plea fading into silence. The quiet inside the cockpit was almost holy. Just the thrum of twin engines behind her, the soft hum of avionics, and the relentless pulse of her heart. In Washington, they would call this discipline following orders, protecting assets. But out here alone over the gorge, discipline sounded a lot like betrayal. Cassie's eyes flicked toward the corner of the canopy where a photograph was taped. Its edges were curled, its colors fading, but the young man's grin was as sharp as ever. Nathan Ward. Her brother. Lost to another war on another ridge when she had followed orders instead of instinct. His last words were pinned down. "We can't move." Words that had burned themselves into her bones and never left. Now another team of Americans was about to be erased in another canyon. And once again, command had chosen to look away. Her thumb hovered over the master arm switch. The red cover gleamed faintly in the glow of the HUD. One motion and everything would change. The radio was quiet now. No one else could see what she saw. No one else would carry the weight if she turned back. A voice older, steadier spoke now. Not over the comms, but directly into the ear of every listener. "If an officer must choose between obedience and a promise to the dead, what would you choose?" The A-10 dipped slightly like a predator testing the air. Cassie's breathing slowed, her pulse steadied. She looked once more at Nathan's photograph, then at the black gorge yawning below. Her thumb lingered on the switch. One decision away from ruin. One decision away from redemption. The silence stretched taut as a wire, and then she pressed. Major Cassandra Ward was 45 years old, though her presence carried the weight of a much older era. In the modern Air Force, she was called a relic sometimes, with affection, more often with impatience. Drones could loiter for hours. Satellites mapped the Earth in color so sharp, it seemed impossible to miss anything. And the younger pilots worshipped sleek fighters with glass cockpits and voice-activated systems. Cassie flew something different, the A-10 Thunderbolt. A beast born not for elegance, but for survival, a machine designed to take punishment and keep flying. To the brass, the Warthog was an outdated tool. To her, it was a companion, scarred but faithful, honest, in ways people no longer were. There had been a time when Cassie was not just tolerated, but celebrated. She wore the patch of the Ghost Riders, a squadron whispered about in briefing rooms, feared by enemies, admired by soldiers on the ground. They flew missions no one else dared low through canyons close enough to see the whites of enemy eyes delivering firepower that changed hopeless battles into survivable ones. But unorthodox squadrons rarely survived the scrutiny of peace. The Ghost Riders were disbanded, labeled too reckless, too uncontrollable for a new age of sanitized war. Their motto, "We go deep, so they come home," faded into dust. Except it didn't. Cassie carried it in her marrow. The reason she carried it was Nathan. Nathan Ward had been 22, an infantryman, with a smile too wide for his young face, and a voice that could fill a room. He was her younger brother, her shadow through childhood, the boy who insisted she teach him how to throw a baseball, how to climb the fence behind their house, how to live bigger than his years. When he joined the Army, Cassie had been both proud and afraid. She thought her presence in the sky would keep him safe, that her watchful eyes and quick trigger would always reach him if trouble came. She was wrong. The memory came in fragments, like shards of glass that never stopped cutting. Nathan's voice on the radio tight with fear, but steady the way soldiers sound when they know their lives depend on calm. "We're pinned down. We can't move." Cassie's hands gripping the controls of her jet, her own voice breaking as she begged permission, requesting engagement, hostile positions identified. "I can take them out." The cold reply from command, negative. "Area is high risk. Hold position. Observe and report." Her pleading again, higher this time, desperate. They won't make it without support. The silence that followed, long, stretching, final. She had obeyed. She had followed orders. And in doing so, she had listened as her brother's voice faded into static, swallowed by the same desert wind she now flew over. That silence never left her. It followed her into every mission, sat with her, in every debrief, lay down with her, in every empty barracks room. She kept his photograph taped, where she could see it not out of sentimentality, but as a reminder of the cost of obedience. When she looked at his grin, she remembered the vow whispered into the night after the funeral, when the folded flag lay heavy in her arms, never leave them behind. The world around her moved on. Technology advanced. Tactics changed. Younger pilots arrived with their sharp haircuts and sharper tongues. They mocked her rituals, running her hands over every rivet of the airframe, tracing the barrel of the GAIU-8 cannon, with reverence checking panels long after the ground crew had signed them off. They called her old school, slow Cassie by the book. She let them. They couldn't know that every careful motion, every deliberate step, was a prayer disguised as procedure. To them, she was obsolete. To her, it was survival not her own, but for those on the ground who depended on her to be perfect, when perfection was the only chance left. And so Cassandra Ward lived in a quiet space, neither celebrated nor discarded. A major with too many scars, both on her aircraft and in her soul. She had become a woman defined not by ambition or medals, but by a single wound. The voice of her brother calling for help she was forbidden to give. Now, with the gorge yawning below, and new voices crackling with the same desperation, Cassie could feel that wound reopening. The silence was coming again, but this time, she still had a choice. The Halidon Gorge Dam rose out of the desert like a monument built by giants, an enormous wall of concrete straddling the canyon's throat, its turbines thrumming beneath the surface like a hidden heart pumping power into the region. By daylight, it looked immovable, eternal. By night, it seemed darker than the cliffs around it, a leviathan crouched across the river, holding back a weight of water so vast that the thought of it breaking was unthinkable. If those gates ever opened all at once, whole towns would vanish. Thousands of families' farms and lives downstream depended on its stability. That was why the Trident team had come. On the ground, moving like shadows through the dust, were a dozen Navy SEALs. At their head was Chief Warrant Officer Mark Callahan, a man who had survived enough campaigns to recognize when something smelled wrong. His voice was gravelly, his humor dry, the kind that appeared only in foxholes. He carried the weight of experience, but also the burden of doubt. Around him moved younger men, some sharp-eyed and steady others, carrying that dangerous swagger of youth, too eager to prove themselves in a fight they barely understood. One cracked a joke over comms about the dam being taller than any building back home. Another muttered that their intel looked too clean, too easy. A third stayed silent, scanning the ridgelines, sensing what Callahan sensed: the desert rarely gave gifts. High above them, Cassie Ward circled at 20,000 feet. From her perch, the gorge was a scar of shadow, the dam a pale monolith under the stars. Her A-10 was a predator in holding pattern, ordered not to strike, not even to dive low. Her role command had told her was overwatch, observe, report, and let the technology do the work. In the operations center hundreds of miles away, glowing screens painted the picture as neat lines and icons. Blue for friendly, red for hostile, white for terrain. A young officer briefed with clinical confidence. We have real-time drone feeds, satellite coverage. No need for unnecessary risks. This will be a clean insertion, precision-driven. The SEALs will breach plant charges, exfiltrate. Air assets remain high altitude. No deviations. The words clean and precision echoed like sales pitches. Cassie had heard them before. They belonged to people who had never felt sand whipped into their teeth or heard the hollow click of a rifle that had run dry. Her canopy showed her something different from those pristine maps. She toggled the thermal pod slung beneath her fuselage, and the green numbers of her HUD dissolved into grainy white heat signatures crawling along the canyon walls. One cluster, then another, then a third. Enemy fighters weren't scattered. They were moving with purpose, sliding into position like fingers closing into a fist. The SEALs were not advancing into opportunity, they were being herded into a kill box. Cassie's thumb pressed her transmit switch. Command Valkyrie 11. Be advised, I have multiple enemy elements converging along the gorge, 3 flanking groups tightening on Trident's position. This is not a sporadic threat, it's coordinated. Requesting permission to engage. A pause. Then the distant voice of control, calm and clipped, negative Valkyrie 11. Drone feeds show no significant enemy concentrations. Your sensors are likely distorted by canyon interference. Mission parameters unchanged. Maintain altitude. Do not engage. Cassie's eyes narrowed. She adjusted the thermal gain, sharpened the image. White-hot signatures glowed unmistakably. Men with rifles, heavy weapons, moving with lethal precision. It was no mirage. She tried again, her tone sharper. Command, I say, again. Trident team is about to be encircled. If I break altitude, I can disrupt the ambush before it closes. The reply came back colder than the stars above her canopy. Mission terminated. Return to base. That is a direct order. For a heartbeat, only silence filled the cockpit. Cassie could hear her own breath inside the helmet, steady but heavy like a woman bracing against a wave. Below her, 12 men were walking into the same fate her brother had once faced, blind, betrayed by intelligence about to be swallowed whole. And once again, command had chosen to look away. The cockpit was dark, except for the steady green glow of the HUD. Cassie's breath fogged faintly against her mask, shallow but deliberate. Her eyes drifted to the photograph taped in the upper corner of the canopy. Nathan, forever young, smiling in a uniform that no longer existed anywhere but memory. The tape was yellowed, its edges fraying, but the grin still had the power to hold her. Her hand hovered over the stick, steady as stone, but her fingers trembled when they reached for the panel. Not out of fear, out of recognition. She had been here before, 20 years earlier, hearing her brother's voice dissolve into static, while orders held her frozen at altitude. Back then, she obeyed, and he was gone. Not this time. She took a breath, deep and slow, as if drawing strength not from the recycled air, but from Nathan himself. Her thumb pushed up the red guard on the master arm switch. The black nub beneath gleamed like a confession waiting to be spoken. Her voice was calm when it broke the silence. Command negative. I'm not leaving them. For a moment, the radio hissed in disbelief. No immediate reply came. No reprimand. Just the brittle crackle of static, as though even the ether understood the gravity of her choice. Then the A-10 dipped. Engines roared a guttural howl tearing across the night sky. The nose fell toward the black maw of Halidon Gorge, a descent that no plan on any screen had accounted for. The wings carved against the wind, the fuselage shuddered, and the ground below rushed up like a rising tide. The aircraft was not graceful. It never had been. It was ugly, brutal, scarred from years of survival, but in her hands, it was transformed into something primal, something alive. Cassie could feel the beast respond, its rumble coursing through her bones, every vibration a heartbeat in sync with her own. Above her, the stars vanished as the canyon walls rose. Below her, men who thought they had been abandoned would soon hear a sound they would never forget, the scream of a warthog diving into hell. The narrator's voice carried the weight of judgment and awe. In that instant, Cassandra Ward ceased to be a relic in the eyes of those who dismissed her. She crossed the line into something rarer, something older. Not a rogue, not a renegade, but a guardian choosing lives over orders, flesh and blood over sterile maps, honor over obedience. And for the first time in 20 years, the silence that haunted her began to crack. The gorge swallowed the A-10 whole, its walls rising like prison bars on either side. Cassie Ward was no longer a distant guardian. Circling in the stratosphere, she was inside the fight, now threading the canyon like a needle through hostile fabric. The silence of indecision was gone. Action thundered in its place. On her thermal display, 3 glowing shapes crouched along a jagged ledge above the dam's western flank. The white-hot outlines of men hunched close together, tubes slung across their shoulders, rocket-propelled grenades. They weren't firing yet. They were waiting for the SEALs to step fully into the open, ready to deliver a blow that would leave no survivors. Cassie's crosshairs found them in less than a breath. Her thumb tightened against the stick. The HUD chirped its confirmation. Then the jaw-wide Avenger spoke. The sound wasn't a simple gunfire, it was a tearing of the sky itself, a metallic bellow that rolled down the gorge like a storm made of iron. Tracer rounds each the size of a soda bottle screamed into the ledge. Rock and flesh vanished together, pulverized into dust and fire. When the echo faded, there was no ledge, left only a cloud of stone fragments raining into the abyss. On the ground, the SEALs froze. They had been seconds from annihilation. Callahan, his face lit by the brief flash of destruction, lowered his weapon with deliberate care. His voice, gravel and disbelief rasped into the net. "Hold your fire, that's friendly." She just saved us. The younger SEALs glanced at one another, shaken. They had all heard the mockery of relics and obsolete planes. Yet here in the jaws of death, the relic was rewriting their fate, with a cannon that sounded like judgment itself. The ambush wasn't broken, it was only shifting. Enemy fire erupted from both rims of the gorge tracer rounds, arcing in red and green across the sky. But their aim was blind, frantic. They had no radar lock, no thermal fix. They only had noise and fear. Cassie pushed her stick forward lower, closer. The walls of Halidon Gorge blurred past her canopy rock layers flashing in bands of gray and ochre. At this altitude, every mistake was death. Yet her breathing slowed her hand steady. She was drawing from muscle memory, older than regulations, from a technique whispered among ghost riders long after the unit had been buried. The carve of the ghost. She dropped into the very seam of the canyon floor, hugging the black ribbon of river that cut through stone. The water's chill masked her heat signature, rendering her nearly invisible to infrared scopes. Above, enemy tracers stitched the sky crisscrossing in patterns, meant to ensnare her. But she wasn't there anymore. She was lower, deeper part of the gorge itself. From the SEAL's position, it looked impossible. One moment, the A-10 had been the target of 100 rifles. The next, she had disappeared beneath the line of fire. Red and green arcs clawed the empty night, while below a guttural roar echoed through the canyon like the growl of some prehistoric beast. Jesus, one of the younger SEALs, muttered, his voice trembling. "She's flying under the rounds." Callahan didn't answer. He just pressed himself tighter against the rock, a grim smile ghosting across his face. He'd seen men do reckless things, but this wasn't recklessness. This was mastery, honed by scars none of these kids carried yet. Cassie's eyes flicked once toward the taped photograph. Nathan would have known. Nathan would have understood. As she climbed back up the canyon's curve, her thermal pod picked up a new heat bloom, an armored shape rolling into a clearing near the dam. 8 wheels steel hide the arrogance of a predator with nothing to fear. A BTR-80. Her instincts pricked. It was moving too openly, too slowly. It wanted to be seen. "Bait," she whispered. She swept her sensors wider. There, a shadow in the cliff face. 2 faint parallel lines too straight to be natural. A concealed twin-barrel ZU-23 anti-aircraft cannon, its metal cooled to match the stone around it, invisible to satellites. A perfect ambush. If she dove at the BTR, she'd fly directly into its jaws. Cassie didn't announce her discovery. She simply acted. She rolled the Warthog into a shallow dive, crosshairs locked squarely on the armored vehicle. Her hood lit up with the sharp tone of a Maverick missile lock. Any watching enemy commander would smile, believing she had taken the bait. She fired. The missile leapt from its pylon, its rocket motor carving a bright trail through the night. For a heartbeat, it seemed to streak straight toward the BTR. Then Cassie's thumb twitched across the hat switch. Her targeting pod slewed in a blur, breaking the missile's lock. The green box of her HUD leapt from the armored car to the hidden gun in the cliffside. The missile curved almost imperceptibly, changing its mind, mid-flight. The BTR stood untouched as the cliff erupted in a sunburst of fire and shattered stone. The ZU-23 and its crew disappeared in a single violent flash, the canyon walls trembling with the echo. From the ground, the SEALs blinked in disbelief. One moment, death had been waiting above them. The next, it was gone, erased by an act of sleight of hand that no manual could have taught. The narrator's voice cut in steady and certain. The bait still stood untouched, but the hunter had just lost his teeth. For the first time since the ambush began, the enemy faltered. Their precision dissolved into confusion, their confidence cracked. And within the cockpit of the battered A-10, Cassie's jaw tightened. The fight was far from over, but the ghost of silence that had haunted her for decades had been driven back by the thunder of her defiance. In the operations center, the air was thick with anger and disbelief. Screens flickered with drone feeds and satellite overlays, but none of them explained the impossible sight of a Warthog diving through Halidon Gorge like it was born there. Colonel Herrick stood rigid, his fists clenched on the edge of the command table. His voice lashed across the room. "She's disobeying every protocol. She severed comms, engaged without authorization, and just jeopardized a $20 million aircraft. This is outright insubordination. Young officers at their consoles shifted uneasily, eyes darting between the furious colonel and the glowing screen, replaying Cassie's canyon carve. None dared speak. From the back of the room, a voice rasped through the tension. "No," it said, gravelly, tired but certain. "That's not insubordination. That's the creed." Heads turned. The speaker was Stokes, a stooped civilian contractor most thought of as little more than a relic himself. His hair was gray, his shoulders permanently rounded from decades bent over engines, and his badge labeled him as a systems analyst. But his eyes, sharp knowing, were fixed on the replay like he was watching an old friend. Herrick sneered. "The creed care to explain what fairy tale you're spinning, Mr. Stokes?" Stokes stepped closer to the main display, his finger tracing the path Cassie had flown. "See here, the way she rode the river's thermal. That's a Ghost Rider maneuver. They taught us to mask heat with water to vanish under tracers. It's not in any manual, haven't been for years." The room was silent. Ghost Riders were shut down for being reckless, Herrick snapped. "They were shut down because they couldn't be controlled," Stokes corrected, his voice sharpening. "They flew into the places command said were impossible. Their motto was simple: we go deep so they come home." He looked up, eyes narrowing. And Major Ward was one of them. A murmur rippled through the room. The puzzle of her defiance suddenly fit. She wasn't improvising. She was remembering. On the ground, Chief Warrant Officer Callahan had been listening. He had watched her destroy the ambush, watched her turn a suicide canyon run into salvation. His men had seen the impossible and lived because of it. He keyed his mic, his tone stripped of fury, steady as bedrock. "Valkyrie. What's your next target?" The words hung heavy in the net. They were not a question of permission, nor a tactical report. They were surrender not to command, but to trust. A transfer of authority as profound as any signed order. Cassie heard it through the static, her gaze flicking once more to Nathan's photo. Her voice came back calm, resolute, carrying the weight of a promise older than regulations. "Copy Ares 1. Stand by. I'll clear your path." In the command center, Herrick froze. A Navy SEAL had just ceded operational control to an Air Force major branded rogue. His face darkened rage, collapsing into a tight mask of humiliation. The chain of command so carefully guarded had been shattered by a single choice. But in the gorge, among the men who lived or died by seconds, the truth was clear. Systems and screens had failed. Protocol had failed. But one pilot had not. The narrator's voice settled over the scene. The mission no longer belonged to the algorithms or the generals. It belonged to a woman who had once been silenced, now flying with the creed of the forgotten. Go deep so they come home. The SEALs had fought their way to the turbine hall, but inside its concrete labyrinth, the battle turned sour. Trident Team was pressed flat against the steel catwalks, pinned by withering fire from entrenched defenders perched above the generators. The turbine hall was a fortress, its walls designed to withstand floods, blasts, and sabotage. Every approach was a funnel, every catwalk a trap. Callahan's voice crackled through the net, harsh with strain. Valkyrie were pinned. Reinforced concrete walls, control room above us. No angle, no way out. If we push, we're cut down. If we hold, we bleed out. Cassie's canopy reflected her own face, hard and still. She had seen this before, in another war, another canyon, when Nathan's voice had begged for air support that never came. The memory pressed against her ribs like a blade. Not again. Her HUD blinked with options, most of them futile. Cannon fire would chip the wall, but never breach it. Rockets would scatter shrapnel, endangering the very men she was here to save. Then her eyes landed on the solution, a GBU-31 JDAM, a 1,000-pound precision-guided bomb too large for subtlety, but with accuracy down to a seam. She keyed her mic. Ares 1, listen carefully. Get your men behind the turbines. Maximum cover. You'll hear thunder, then you'll have your way out. There was hesitation on the other end. Then Callahan's curt reply, copy Valkyrie. We'll move. Cassie banked the Warthog into a wide loop, climbing just enough to line up the shot. Her targeting pod slewed onto the side of the turbine hall, searching for weakness. There, a seam in the concrete, where decades of stress had left hairline fractures invisible to the naked eye, but bright under thermal contrast. A scar in the fortress. Her thumb toggled the release. Target acquired. Bomb away. The aircraft jolted as the GBU dropped a dark shape hurtling earthward. For 3 eternal seconds, the canyon held its breath. Then the world split open. The explosion slammed into the turbine hall with a concussive roar, not scattering debris outward, but punching through, tearing a perfect wound in the wall. Dust smoke and fractured concrete rained down. Inside, the defenders were obliterated, their cover shattered. The catwalk shook, then fell silent. Callahan's voice, ragged, but alive, filled the net breach complete. We're moving. Valkyrie, you just gave us our door. Cassie exhaled once, relief fleeting. But before she could bank away, a new alarm shrieked in her headset. Upstream along the dam's spine, enormous gears ground into motion. The canyon vibrated with a sound, older than war, the deep metallic groan of floodgates stirring. On her thermal display, she saw the hydraulic arms wrench open one after another. Not one gate, not 2. All 11. The roar of water was immediate and terrifying. Cassie's stomach dropped. This wasn't tactical defense, this was vengeance. The enemy, enraged at losing control of the turbine hall, had chosen spite over survival. 11 spillways opened, unleashing the river's captive fury. Her targeting pod swept downstream, and her blood ran cold. Villages dotted the valley floor, tiny clusters of heat signatures, families, sleeping children in their beds, farms waiting for dawn. In less than an hour, every one of them would be underwater. The mission had changed. It was no longer about saving 12 men with rifles. It was about saving thousands of innocents who didn't even know death was rushing toward them. The narrator's voice deepened, solemn. What began as a battle for a team's survival had become a race against annihilation. From one promise to one brother, the stakes had grown to thousands of lives, and Cassandra Ward, alone in her cockpit engines, screaming fuel running thin, was the only barrier left between them and the flood. The Warthog trembled like a wounded beast. Warning lights bled across Cassie's cockpit, amber red, flashing in an angry chorus. One engine was gone, shredded by the blast of a man-pad's hit. The remaining engine coughed and roared, dragging the battered jet through the air on stubborn will alone. Smoke trailed behind her, a dark scar against the pale dawn. Cassie's arms ached. Every muscle screamed as she fought the stick, forcing the aircraft to obey. The canopy above her was fractured spiderweb cracks, spreading outward from the impact of shrapnel. Through them, Nathan's photo still clung to its corner, his grin unbroken despite the chaos. Her breath rasped in her headset, shallow, exhausted. Her body was drained, her spirit nearly hollow. Yet her eyes burned with the last embers of defiance. She keyed the mic, her voice stripped to its barest truth. I promised. I finish. The words weren't for command. They weren't for Callahan or his SEALs. They were for Nathan and for the villages below, unaware of the tidal wall about to descend upon them. She leveled the nose toward the dam's eastern flank, where the massive hydraulic manifold gleamed under the strain of 11 roaring spillway gates. It was the heart of the flood, a steel knot that could only be severed by force. The suicide run began. Alarms wailed like banshees. The radar altimeter screamed its continuous warning tone, useless now, but unrelenting. Tracer fire erupted from the cliffs, lacing the air with incandescent death. Red arcs slashed across her canopy, green tracers stitched past her wings. But Cassie didn't flinch. Her focus narrowed to the manifold, a single target in a world of chaos. The A-10 groaned as she pushed it lower, faster smoke pouring from its side, like blood from an open wound. The controls resisted heavy as stone, but she forced them every inch, bought with raw strength. The canopy cracked wider, a jagged starburst spreading across Nathan's face. Cassie smiled grimly. "Hold on, little brother. Just a little longer?" Her thumb settled on the trigger. The G-08 had almost nothing left to give, 30 rounds, maybe less, but it was enough. The cannon roared one final time. The sound was thunder and judgment, a tearing of the earth itself. Depleted uranium shells screamed into the manifold, shredding steel pipes, puncturing pistons, chewing into the hydraulic heart. Sparks exploded, fire blossomed, gears shrieked as they seized. One by one, the massive spillway gates juddered, groaned, and froze. The roar of water softened, then stilled. The valley below the farms, the villages, the children sleeping in their beds, was spared. Cassie let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Relief washed over her, but it was fleeting, because the enemy wasn't finished. From a ridge near the dam, a single gunner, ragged but defiant, lifted a shoulder-fired launcher. The missile streaked upward, a final desperate act of spite. Cassie saw the plume too late. She yanked the stick, but the A-10 was crippled, too slow to respond. The blast detonated near her left wing, ripping metal apart, sending the jet into a violent roll. The cockpit erupted in alarms. Hydraulics bled out. Control surfaces stiffened. The Warthog wanted to die. Cassie fought with everything left inside her. Her arms strained, her teeth clenched. The world spun, sky and canyon trading places in a sickening blur. She bit down a cry of rage, forcing the nose to level inch by inch. "Not yet," she growled. "Not yet." The mesa loomed ahead, a flat stretch of rock, brutal and unforgiving, but her only chance. She throttled what power remained into the surviving engine, coaxing the beast through its death throes. The A-10 slammed down hard. Metal screamed against stone, sparks erupting in a fiery trail. The belly of the aircraft tore open, scattering fragments across the mesa. The jet skidded for hundreds of feet, gouging an ugly scar into the earth, before shuddering to a halt in a choking cloud of dust and smoke. Silence followed. A silence so deep it rang in her ears, more absolute than the roar of engines or cannon fire. Cassie's shoulder blazed with pain as she forced herself free from the harness. Her left arm dangled uselessly, but her right hand gripped the canopy release, shoving it open with a grunt. Cool air rushed in, carrying the scent of sagebrush and scorched metal. She crawled out onto the broken fuselage boots, crunching against twisted steel. Her chest heaved every breath, a battle. She looked back once at the wreck of her Warthog, the beast that had carried her through 2 decades of war and through this final gauntlet. Ugly. Brutal. Loyal to the last. Her knees gave out and she sank onto the scorched rock, head bowed. She had done it. The seals were alive. The valley was safe. The promise was kept. Above the settling dust, the rhythmic chop of helicopter blades grew louder. Black silhouettes crested the ridge. A Blackhawk descended its rotors, tearing the dawn apart. The ramp dropped before the skids touched. Mark Callahan leapt out, his men at his heels. They sprinted to the wreckage, weapons slung, eyes blazing with urgency. Cassie raised her head as they reached her. Callahan's voice was rough, absolute. "We are not leaving you behind." Strong arms lifted her from the torn metal, carrying her toward the waiting bird. She didn't resist. For the first time in years, she let someone else carry the weight. The valley lived. The team endured. And Cassandra Ward, scarred, exhausted, yet unbroken, proved that a single promise could be stronger than any order, stronger than fear, stronger even than death itself. Her Warthog lay silent on the mesa, a monument to defiance. But she walked away alive, carrying with her not just the creed of the Ghost Riders, but the trust of every man she saved. In the end, the machine was broken. The woman was not. The Black Hawk cut through the dawn, its rotors hammering the air as it flared above the scarred mesa. Dust swirled around the wreck of the A-10, a broken beast still smoking from its wounds. The ramp dropped before the skids even touched rock. Mark Callahan was the first out. His boots slammed against stone, and in seconds he was at Cassie's side. Her body was bruised, her flight suit scorched, but her eyes tired as they were still held that fierce fire. He didn't ask if she could walk. He simply bent down, his voice rough but steady. "We are not leaving you behind." Two SEALs lifted her, gently cradling her weight, as if she were one of their own. Together they carried her up the ramp, past the staring eyes of warriors who knew they owed her everything. The Black Hawk lifted, banking toward base. When they landed, the usual chaos of the flight line was absent. No clatter of tools, no shouted orders, no laughter of ground crew. The tarmac had fallen into a silence more powerful than ceremony. Mechanics, pilots, and airmen lined the edges, their hands still, their gazes fixed. No one saluted. No one cheered. They simply watched as Cassie stepped down, her arm still in a sling, the SEALs flanking her like a guard of honor. Respect didn't need words. Respect was silence. Her boots scraped against the concrete every step, an echo in the hush. The younger pilots, those who once mocked her as slow, outdated a relic, stood rigid, their faces stripped of arrogance. Raptor, the brashest of them all, finally stepped forward. His helmet dangled uselessly from his hand. He searched her face, fumbling for words that refused to come. At last, he asked the only question that mattered. "How did you do it?" Cassie paused, her gaze moving from him to the cracked canopy of the Black Hawk, then back to the line of faces watching. When she spoke, her voice carried not just to Raptor, but to every man and woman standing silent on that tarmac. "The manual keeps you alive," she said softly. "And most days, that's enough. But one day you'll know. You'll know when the book will get someone else killed. And that day, you don't fly for the rules. You fly for them." Her words settled like weight on their shoulders, not as a burden, but as a truth. Raptor's head dipped, the cocky gleam in his eyes replaced by something deeper: respect, humility, maybe even understanding. Cassie turned and walked on her steps, unhurried, her presence larger than any medal or commendation could give. Behind her, the line of silent airmen parted, each of them carrying the unspoken realization that they had just witnessed something rare, not defiance, but devotion. She returned not as a relic, not as a rogue, but as a guardian who kept a promise. The silence of the flight line was her salute. The respect of her peers was her reward. And in the eyes of those she saved, Cassandra Ward was no longer a forgotten pilot. She was a living creed. Cassie's room was quiet, a soldier's cell stripped of warmth. The walls were bare, the bed sharply made, the air carrying only the faint hum of distant machinery. Yet on the small wooden desk by her cot lay two objects that broke the monotony. She placed them there herself, with a hand still trembling from exhaustion. One was old, a frayed patch from the Ghost Riders, its black thread worn thin, the skeletal horseman faded from years of dust and sweat. It was the emblem of a squadron that no longer existed, disbanded because they flew too close, cared too much, broke too many rules to save men others had written off. To Cassie, it was Nathan's memory, stitched into cloth, a reminder of a promise forged in grief. The other was new. black fabric embroidered with the golden trident and anchor of the seals, left quietly at her door by men who had once doubted her, then entrusted her with their lives. It was gratitude in its purest form, a silent acknowledgement that she had stood in the gap when no one else would. The two patches sat side by side, past and present wound and healing grief and gratitude. She lowered herself into the chair, her body heavy, but her spirit strangely light. Her fingers lingered on both patches, bridging the years between loss and redemption. The narrator's voice settled in slow and reverent. This is not the story of disobedience. It is the story of a promise, of a woman who refused to let silence have the last word, of honor that does not live in manuals or procedures, but in the quiet choices made when no one is watching. Cassandra Ward was called reckless, rogue, obsolete. But in the eyes of those she saved, she was none of those things. She was a guardian angel. The camera of imagination pulls back, showing Cassie alone, her head bowed, the two patches glowing softly in the dim light. Her life, her career, her future remained uncertain. The inquiries, the judgments, the paperwork of war would follow. But here in this silent room, she had already received the only commendation that mattered. The lives saved, the trust, earned the promise kept. The narrator's tone softened, but carried a note of hope. In the end, it is not medals or promotions that define us. It is the people who walk away because we stood our ground. It is the promises we keep even when the cost is unbearable. Cassie Ward did not choose the safe path. She chose the human one. And because she did, a valley slept through the dawn, unaware of the flood that never came. A pause. Then gently, a question that turns outward. What about you? If the day comes when rules demand silence and conscience demands action, what promise will you keep? If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of duty of family, of the promises that still guide your heart, share it. Share it with someone who needs to believe that one voice, one choice can still matter. Leave your thoughts below. Tell us the promises you've seen kept when it mattered most. And if you wish to walk with us through more stories of courage and quiet honor, join us. Like, subscribe, and stay with us. There are many more stories to tell.